a settler's garden was not meant to stand alone. The pioneers knew a secret that we are only now rediscovering, that a garden full of bees, butterflies, and birds is a garden that thrives, and one that is silent and still is a garden that struggles. So they grew certain plants for one special purpose: to call the helpful creatures in. The settlers understood that the bees and butterflies carried the precious pollen that made the crops bear fruit, and that the birds ate the insects that threatened the harvest. These were not pests to be driven off, but allies to be welcomed. And so the pioneers planted flowers and herbs that would draw this helpful life into the garden, filling it with buzzing, fluttering, singing abundance. In the next half hour, I am going to show you 7 plants the settlers grew to attract bees, butterflies, and helpful birds to the garden. What each one drew in, and why it mattered so much to the harvest. And number 5 is a plant you very likely have growing right now, that the settlers prized as one of the greatest magnets for garden life of all. To a settler family, a garden alive with bees and birds was a garden that would feed them well. Without the bees and butterflies to carry the pollen, many crops would bear little or no fruit. Without the birds to eat the caterpillars and beetles, the pests would multiply unchecked. The settlers understood these deep connections, and they gardened to honor them, planting to bring the helpers home. A quick and honest word before we begin. Everything I share here is history and tradition, offered for curiosity and for the love of old, fading knowledge. It is not medical advice. As always, never use any plant without proper knowledge. With that understood, let us step back in time. Welcome to the American Settler Garden, where we dig up the forgotten plant wisdom of America's pioneers. The families who knew that a thriving garden was a living community, and who planted to fill it with helpful life. The settlers gardened in a way we are only now learning to value again. They did not see the garden as a battlefield against all of nature, but as a partnership with it. They knew that the buzzing bee and the fluttering butterfly were doing essential work, carrying pollen from flower to flower, so that the squash, the beans, the fruit trees, and so many other crops could bear their harvest. And they knew the birds were mighty hunters of the very pests that troubled the crops, a single family of birds devouring countless insects in a season. So the wise settler planted to welcome these allies, growing the flowers whose nectar drew the bees and butterflies, and the plants whose seeds and shelter drew the helpful birds. A garden planned this way hummed and sang with life, and it bore all the better for it. Much of this wisdom came from careful observation and from the native peoples who understood these living connections deeply. Together it became the living art of the settler garden. And like so much of it, it faded when we began to fight nature with chemicals instead of working with it. Today we remember it, beginning with the first plant. And as we go, hold on to the heart of this wisdom, for it is perhaps the most important lesson the settlers can teach the modern gardener. A garden is not a thing apart from nature to be defended against it, but a living community to be welcomed and nurtured. The settlers gardened in partnership with the bees, the butterflies, and the birds, and that partnership was the secret of their abundance. Number 1. Bee balm. The settlers found bee balm so beloved by the hummingbirds in particular, that a planting of it brought these darting jewels right up to the cabin, a wonder and a delight to the whole family. That it also drew the bees and butterflies that pollinated the crops only made this beautiful plant more precious in their eyes. Its very name tells you its purpose. Bee balm, a tall plant with shaggy, vivid flowers in reds, pinks, and purples, was one of the settlers' most treasured plants for drawing the bees and butterflies, and the hummingbirds too, into the garden. Few plants are so beloved by the pollinators. Settler families planted bee balm in their gardens and near their crops, where its bright, nectar-rich flowers called in the bees, the butterflies, and the darting hummingbirds in great numbers. The pollinators flocked to it, and in coming, they carried their precious pollen to the surrounding crops as well. A patch of bee balm was a beacon, drawing the helpful creatures from far and wide and setting the whole garden humming. The secret is in the abundant sweet nectar of those shaggy flowers, irresistible to the bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds alike, and shaped to welcome them. The settlers planted it, knowing it would call the pollinators in, and where the pollinators gathered, the crops bore better. It was a living invitation, planted in the soil, and there was a wisdom in this way of gardening that ran deeper than mere usefulness. The settlers understood that they were part of the living world, not its master, and that a garden thrived when it welcomed the whole community of life. To plant for the bees and the birds was to take a humble and grateful place within nature, and to be rewarded with abundance for it. And bee balm gave more than its magnetism, for its fragrant leaves made a treasured tea, valued in the old traditions, with a scent like fragrant herbs. A plant that drew the pollinators and made a fine tea besides was doubly prized. To use it as the settlers did, plant bee balm near your crops to call in the bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds. The next plant was the towering beacon of the garden. Planted near the crops, the bee balm called in the bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds in humming, darting multitudes, setting the whole garden alive and bearing all the better for their work. Number 2. Sunflower. The settlers valued the sunflower as a feast that served the garden in 2 seasons, the pollinators flocking to its bright face in summer and the birds to its heavy seeds in fall. To plant a row of sunflowers was to feed a whole shifting community of helpers from one generous towering plant. The tall golden sunflower, which we have seen serve so many uses, was also one of the great magnets for garden life, drawing in both the pollinators to its broad, bright face and the birds to its heavy seed heads. It stood in the garden like a beacon, calling life from all around. Settler families planted sunflowers knowing that their wide, nectar and pollen-rich flowers drew the bees and butterflies in abundance through the summer. And then, as the great seed heads ripened, they called in the birds, who feasted on the rich seeds. The settlers welcomed these birds, for in visiting, they also hunted the insects of the garden. The sunflower fed and sheltered a whole community of helpful creatures. The broad face of the sunflower is a perfect landing place and a rich source of pollen and nectar for the bees and butterflies, while its seeds are a feast for the birds. The settlers planted it to serve every helper at once, the pollinators in its bloom and the birds in its seed. It was generosity itself, towering over the garden, and the settlers took real delight in the life their gardens drew. For a garden humming with bees and bright with butterflies and alive with bird song was a joy as well as a harvest. After the hard labor of planting and tending, to sit and watch the garden, teeming with the life they had welcomed, was one of the quiet rewards of the settlers' work. And the sunflower, of course, gave its seeds and oil for the family, its stalks for many uses, and its beauty to the garden besides, one of the most generous plants of all. To use it as the settlers did, plant sunflowers to draw the pollinators in summer and the helpful birds in fall. The next plant was the fragrant cloud that called the bees. Planted for summer and fall alike, the sunflowers fed the pollinators in their bloom and the birds in their seed, a towering feast for a whole community of the garden's helpers. Number 3. Lavender. The settlers planted lavender near the hives, and the crops especially, knowing its long bloom would keep the bees fed, and working through many weeks of summer. A border humming audibly with contented bees was a sign of a healthy garden, and a promise of the better harvest their work would bring. Our beloved lavender returns, for beyond its many gifts to the home, the settlers prized it as one of the finest plants for drawing the bees and butterflies to the garden. A lavender in full bloom hums audibly with the bees that flock to its fragrant purple flowers. Settler families planted lavender in their gardens and near their crops, where its abundant, nectar-rich, fragrant flowers drew the bees and butterflies in great humming numbers through its long bloom. The pollinators adored it, and in visiting, they carried pollen through the whole garden. A border of lavender was both a joy to the family and a feast for the bees, alive with their gentle buzzing all summer long. The rich nectar and powerful fragrance of lavender's flowers call the pollinators from afar, and its long blooming season feeds them for many weeks. The settlers knew that a planting of lavender kept the bees and butterflies in the garden through much of the summer, working all the while among the crops. It was a fragrant, living magnet, and the settlers understood the deep partnership between the pollinators and the harvest. In a way we sometimes forget, they knew that the humming of the bees among the lavender meant the squash and the beans, and the fruit would set and swell, that the work of these small creatures was woven into the very food on the table. To feed the bees was to feed the family, and lavender, of course, gave its perfume to the home, its calm to the spirit, and its guard against moths besides, beloved in every way. To use it as the settlers did, plant lavender to draw the bees and butterflies and feed them through the summer. The next plant was the cheerful daisy of the garden. Planted in fragrant borders, the lavender kept the bees and butterflies humming among the crops through the long weeks of summer, a living magnet of nectar and scent. Number 4. Echinacea. The settlers treasured echinacea as a native flower that the local bees and birds had always loved, perfectly suited to the land and its creatures. Hardy, tough, and faithful, it fed the pollinators in summer and the finches in winter, asking almost nothing while giving life to the garden across the seasons. Echinacea, the purple coneflower, is a tall, hardy wildflower with large daisy, like blooms of purple petals around a raised orange center, and it was one of the settlers' valued plants for drawing pollinators and birds alike. A native treasure of the American plains, it was beloved by the helpful creatures of the garden. Settler families grew echinacea, and its large, nectar-rich flowers drew the bees and butterflies all through its long summer bloom. Then, as the flowers faded and the spiky seed heads formed, they drew in the finches and other small birds, who feasted on the seeds through the fall and winter. Like the sunflower, echinacea served the pollinators in its bloom and the birds in its seed, a magnet for life in every season. The rich nectar of the coneflower draws the pollinators, while its sturdy seed heads hold a feast for the birds long after the bloom is gone. The settlers valued it for feeding the garden helpers across the seasons, and for being tough, native, and hardy besides, asking little and giving much. It was a faithful magnet for life, and the settlers valued the native plants like echinacea for belonging so perfectly to the land and its creatures. These were the flowers the local bees and birds had always known and loved, suited to the soil and the seasons of this place, and the settlers learned to treasure them as the truest and hardiest magnets for the life of the garden. And echinacea was treasured in the old healing traditions as well, a plant of deep value to the native peoples and the settlers alike, though as always I share that only as history. To use it as the settlers did, plant echinacea to draw the pollinators in summer and the birds in fall. And now we come to the one I promised you. Planted for the seasons, the echinacea drew the pollinators in summer and the finches in fall, a hardy native feast for the garden's helpers across the year. And now we reach number 5. The one I promised you, a plant you very likely have growing right now that the settlers prized as one of the greatest magnets for garden life of all. Number 5. Clover. The settlers welcomed clover where others saw only a weed, for they knew its sweet flowers were among the finest of all foods for the bees. A patch of blooming clover hummed with their work, fed the livestock, and enriched the very soil, a humble plant the wise settler was always glad to see. Yes, common clover, That humble plant we so often dismiss as a mere lawn weed was one of the settlers' most valued plants for drawing the bees and enriching the whole garden. The settlers knew that a field or border of clover was a treasure, alive with bees and good for the very soil. Settler families grew clover and welcomed it, for its abundant sweet flowers were among the very finest sources of nectar for the bees, who flocked to it in humming multitudes. A patch of blooming clover fed the bees richly, and the bees in turn pollinated the surrounding crops. Clover was also grown as feed for the livestock, and, like the beans, it enriched the soil itself, drawing nourishment from the air and leaving the ground richer. The sweet nectar-rich flowers of clover are a beloved feast for the bees, and its long bloom feeds them through much of the season. The settlers knew that clover kept the bees fed and the garden humming, while also feeding the animals and enriching the soil beneath. Few humble plants gave so much in so many ways at once, and the settlers saw in the humble clover a lesson they took to heart: that the most despised and overlooked things often held the greatest worth. A plant pulled and poisoned as a weed by the careless was, to the wise settler, a feast for the bees, a feed for the animals, and a gift to the soil, treasured by those who took the time to truly see it. And so clover was a feast for the bees, a feed for the animals, and a gift to the soil, all from a plant we now poison as a weed. To use it as the settlers did, grow clover to feed the bees, enrich the soil, and draw life to the garden. The next plant was the fragrant herb beloved by the butterflies. Welcomed where it grew, the clover fed the bees richly, enriched the soil, and fed the animals, a humble feast the wise settler was always glad to see. Number 6. Borage. The settlers planted borage near the hives above all, for its blue stars refilled their nectar so swiftly that the bees returned again and again, kept busy and fed all season long. A planting of borage was like a living fountain for the bees, never running dry, drawing them faithfully to work among the crops. Borage is a sprawling herb with bristly leaves and beautiful star-shaped blue flowers, and it was one of the settlers' great favorites for drawing the bees in particular, so beloved by them that it was sometimes called the bee plant. Its bright blue stars are a magnet for the pollinators. Settler families planted borage among their crops, especially near the vegetables and the beehives, where its abundant blue flowers drew the bees in remarkable numbers all season long. Borage is famous for refilling its nectar quickly, so the bees returned to it again and again, kept busy and fed among the garden. A planting of borage near the crops meant a garden full of bees, and the better harvest that followed. The star-shaped blue flowers of borage are extraordinarily rich in nectar, and they renew that nectar swiftly, making borage one of the most reliable bee plants of all. The settlers planted it precisely to keep the bees fed and working among the crops, and they prized it for how faithfully it drew them. It was a living fountain for the bees. And borage gave more, for its leaves and flowers were edible, with a cool cucumber taste, adding food and beauty to the table besides. A plant that fed the bees and the family alike was a true garden treasure. To use it as the settlers did, plant borage among your crops and near your hives to keep the bees fed and working. The final plant was the herb that fed both bees and birds. Planted near the hives, the borage kept the bees fed and working with its ever-renewing nectar, a living fountain drawing them faithfully to the crops. Number 7. Dill. The settlers valued dill for the hidden helpers it drew, the tiny beneficial insects too small for larger flowers, which hunted the very pests that threatened the crops. To plant dill was to call in a whole unseen army of allies, doubling the herb's gift to the thriving garden. We close with dill, that tall feathery herb we have seen guard the garden. For the settlers also valued it as a magnet for helpful life, drawing in the pollinators and the beneficial insects that protect the crops. Its clouds of tiny yellow flowers are a beacon for the garden's allies. Settler families planted dill among and near their vegetables, where its small clustered flowers drew in the bees and butterflies, and especially the helpful predatory insects, the tiny wasps and others that hunt the garden pests. Dill also drew certain butterflies to lay their eggs, and the settlers welcomed the caterpillars and the butterflies they became. A planting of dill filled the garden with pollinators and with the natural enemies of the pests alike. The tiny flowers of dill are perfectly suited to feed the small beneficial insects, the ones too small for larger flowers, drawing in a whole hidden army of garden helpers. The settlers valued dill for bringing in both the pollinators and these tiny allies, doubling its gift to the garden. It was a magnet for the unseen helpers as much as the seen, and dill, of course, flavored the family's food and famously their pickles, helping store the harvest besides, a guardian and a magnet and a seasoning all at once. To use it as the settlers did, plant dill among your crops to draw the pollinators and the helpful insects. Planted among the crops, the dill drew in the pollinators and the hidden army of helpful insects alike, a magnet for the garden's seen and unseen allies. And in our own time, when the bees and the pollinators face such hardship, there is something both hopeful and urgent in this old knowledge. The settlers knew how to make a garden that fed and sheltered these precious creatures, and in doing so fed themselves. To garden their way, welcoming the bees and the birds, is not only to honor the past, but to help heal the living world around us today. So there you have it. 7 plants the settlers grew to attract bees, butterflies, and helpful birds to the garden. Bee balm, the beloved beacon of the pollinators. Sunflower, the towering feast for bee and bird alike. Lavender, the humming fragrant magnet. Echinacea, the native flower for pollinators and finches. Clover, the humble feast for the bees. The borage, the bright blue fountain of nectar. And dill, the magnet for the garden's hidden helpers. Every one of them filled the settler garden with buzzing, fluttering, singing life, the bees and butterflies carrying the pollen that made the crops bare, the birds hunting the pests that threatened them. The settlers did not garden against nature. They invited it in, and their gardens thrived for it, alive with the helpers they had welcomed home. And these 7 are only part of the settlers' living garden. As I dug into this, I found far more than I could fit into one video. The full art of drawing helpful life into the garden the old way, all laid out in simple pages. I gathered it into a guide called The Settler's Living Garden. If you would like a copy to keep, the link is waiting for you down in the description below. And if you believe this old knowledge is worth keeping alive, worth passing on the way the settlers passed it on, then go ahead and subscribe. That is all it takes to see the next one. Because once the garden had given its abundance, the settlers faced their greatest task of all, saving that harvest through the long winter. Next, I want to show you the plants the settlers dried and preserved to last all winter long, the secret of how they survived the cold months. That story is playing right here. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I will see you in the next one.